Rajeev, can you tell us who you are and what you do?
I'm an academic, sort of late in my life. I spent many years in industry.
Rajeev, can you describe to us the course that you'd like to highlight?
This is a course on technology and innovation that I've been teaching at the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore, India for about 10 years. And the idea behind it is to see if there is a structured way in which you can understand the whole process of innovation.
Rajeev, you're teaching innovation in India. I'd be interested to hear how innovation is happening differently in India when you look at your case studies.
Many people are discouraged from starting out and doing risky things in entrepreneurial ventures in India because there is a social stigma, if you will, attached to it. Because the point is, if you fail, then most people may forgive you, except, as I tell my students, one person, that is your mother-in-law, who will keep bringing it up at very awkward moments that, you married my daughter and see what you did, you failed. So I'm exaggerating a little bit, of course, but there is a general tendency to look for security and safety. So most people have preferred to work for multinationals or work for the government or something like that. Now that is changing, and I see elements of that quite a bit these days, because people have seen a lot of case studies, if you will. Big IT companies, Infosys, Wipro, Tata, etc., have done well, and the people who started them have done well, and even their employees have done well. So as a result of that, there is a slow movement towards entrepreneurship, and the Indian government has recognized this as a very valuable thing for the future. So they're doing lots of things to encourage entrepreneurs and innovators. The other side of the picture is that in an unfortunate development, the Indian school system and the Indian college system in general does not lead to much innovation. We find that a lot of the research that's done is somewhat derivative. People simply copy what happened elsewhere, and that's the extent to which they invent new things. So the supply chain, if you will, is broken there. So these are some of the problems. And the third major problem is a lack of venture financing. There's very little risk finance available. And even the companies that call themselves venture finance or VCs, they tend to be more along the lines of private equity. They want to come in at a somewhat later stage, less risk. Because I was on a couple of VC boards, and they're not very risk-seeking. Of course, the other side of it is their rewards are not very high either. So there are several structural problems. But now I think things are beginning to improve in the sense that, unfortunately, the education system is still broken on average, but the availability of risk capital, especially from angels, has gone up.
What are the key messages or the key message that you'd like your students to take away from your course?
One of the key messages is that creativity is not anybody's birthright per se. We're all creative people. The second step is it's not necessarily the idea that is critical, it's the implementation. And even if you're copying somebody else's idea, it's all right. In fact, it's very likely that 10 people have the same idea at a given time, and only 1 or 2 of them will succeed because they've been able to do the operations very well. And the third major point I'd like to make to them is that there are opportunities in many, many areas these days that may not have been there a few years ago. IT is an obvious example, but I see energy as a huge area, especially in a developing country like India.
Everyone has a right to be creative. Many companies have the word innovation inscribed as part of their core values. But what separates the wheat from the chaff?
There are no simple cookbook examples or mechanisms, because I worked in a diverse set of companies. One was Bell Labs, which was probably the most innovative company in the world in its heyday. And unfortunately, after a certain point, it has deteriorated and it's no longer a fount of new ideas. Now, their case was that they were willing to and able to fund what might be called totally blue sky innovation, things that didn't necessarily have anything to do with the parent company AT&T's telecom business. So for example, somebody was out there, his name was Arno Penzias, he was looking at cosmic radiation, and he won a Nobel Prize for it, none of which was particularly useful to AT&T at the time, but over time it became highly important in science. But that's one model where you allow people to go off and do anything they want. Another example of this is Xerox's Palo Alto Lab Park, which invented pretty much everything you use in a computer, but Xerox made practically no money out of it. So that's one end of the picture. The other end of the picture is where it's a process innovation. And there are several Indian companies that have done brilliantly at this. One example is an eye clinic called Aravind Eye Care. Extraordinary success story in that what they've done is they've taken the process of eye surgery, for example, cataract surgery, and they have, in a sense, McDonaldized it. And now that's a terrible thing to say, but what they've done is they've divided up the process of eye surgery into a few microsurgeries. So instead of one surgeon doing the entire operation, you have what amounts to an assembly line. The first surgeon opens the eye, the second surgeon removes the bad lens, the third surgeon inserts a new lens, and the fourth surgeon sews you up. It turns out that this process improvement enables you to be dramatically more productive. And the doctors become far more experienced at doing their one bit. So when Aravind started, their objective was to have eye surgery at 1/10 the world cost, 10%. In fact, they're at 1/100th the world cost. That's what I tell my students. Don't think there is one way of being successful in innovation. There are many ways, and depends. And it also depends on the environment to a great extent. What works in America may not work in India.
Speaking of innovation, bringing it to market, how has the process changed over the recent years?
The biggest problem that I've seen is that many entrepreneurs are technically very good, but they're not very marketing savvy, and they end up not being able to get distribution together. That is to say, they have a product and then they expect the world to beat a path to their door, as in the famous saying, you invent a better mousetrap, but unfortunately that's not true. You invent a better mousetrap and nobody comes. So that part, which is the ability to distribute, has become dramatically more efficient, especially for people doing software. I think a big difference is, as you have seen with many of the Netexplo laureates, they come up with something in Chile, but lo and behold, that's in demand in France.
There's often an advantage to be the first mover, but there's also a big question of who owns the intelligence behind the innovation. Talk us through where we are in that, considering all the patent battles you might find out there.
On the one hand, we have a tradition where people invent things and put them out there in the public domain. As an example, the person who invented the zero and the number system is an unknown. He didn't bother to sign it. So that's sort of the way things have been done. Unfortunately, as you know, the world doesn't work that way anymore. There is a very strong patent regime. I'm not sure the right thing is to say it's forced to follow it, but India has to pretty much deal with it. And I happen to be on a national panel which has been put together to come up with an intellectual property policy for the country. And that is developing now. Over the next few months, it'll be out there for public review. We put out the first draft, and there were responses from the European Union, there were responses from the Americans, etc. And the burning issue, if you will, is that of pharma. Okay, because in India we have a lot of generics companies, and they are successfully bringing out unbranded products at maybe 1/10 or less the cost of a product from Glaxo or Sanofi or somebody like that. So this is a big battle, and the Indian government has consistently held that the rights of the poor patients may override the patent rights of the multinationals. But there are some other smaller issues, something that's very relevant to innovators in India. One is the idea of a petty patent, otherwise known as a utility model. For example, to get a patent which will give you a first mover advantage for the next 20 years is expensive and complicated and difficult. And many of our entrepreneurs who tend to be, or I should say inventors, who tend to be rural people who came up with an idea that is interesting, but it's not worth the effort to go for a full patent. They just abandon it, and then it gets picked up by somebody else. So we have suggested in our draft that there should be a petty patent mechanism whereby for a small amount of effort, you get a small amount of protection, right? I'll give you an example. In India, the electricity is not very reliable. A young woman invented a washing machine which she connected to a bicycle. So you ride your bicycle and you get your exercise and your washing machine works. Now that's a petty patent, right? Another guy invented something that enables you to cool things to a certain extent without electricity, using the principle of passive evaporation. If you put out a jug made out of clay, it evaporates and then it keeps the water cool. That's another small thing. So I think, especially in emerging countries, this is an important thing, to give the small guy the ability to protect to some extent their ideas. Because otherwise, if the ideas are not valuable, nobody will have ideas.
So Rajeev, you have a background in business, you're in academia, and in academia, research and case studies are oftentimes the basis of work. And yet in this world of innovation and fast pace and digital, some of the case studies are outdated the day that they've arrived, if not already before. How do you deal with that? And how has research had to change and case studies changed in today's world?
This is a major problem that our students have, because a number of my case studies that I get from textbooks and so forth, or their repositories, are 3, 5, 10 years old, and they find them uninteresting because it's known stuff. They know what happened, so there is no, if you will, surprise element. So it's sort of like, yeah, this is the way it should be done because we know that's what they did. So it would be a great help to academics like me and our students if we can get things that are works in progress.
When we're looking in bringing innovation to market, what do you need to have in terms of an internal culture to foster innovation?
Unfortunately, I'm sure this is true in Europe, but in India, there is a hierarchy, much more so than, say, in the US, because when I worked in the US, it was a custom that you could walk up to the president of the company and address him by his first name, and that is not true in India. In fact, if a senior manager comes into a room, everybody stands up, and that was a problem for me when I first went back to India. I walk into a room and everybody stands up. I'm like, please sit down. That kind of a hierarchy also inhibits people from saying, look, I have an idea, okay? And those companies that are willing to listen to people, an example was Toyota. A number of years ago, they started this suggestion box mechanism, and it saved them a lot of trouble, because people on the assembly lines actually know best what needs to be done, and not necessarily the production engineers or the senior managers. Similarly, there is an Indian company. It is a Tata subsidiary, and it's called Titan. They're a watch and jewelry company. So I was over at their plant near Bangalore some time ago. They instituted something along the same lines. It's quite an interesting place to go to, because you have these huge ingots of gold to handle, and they go to great lengths to make sure that whatever gold has adhered to your clothes is also captured, because they make you wear a clean room outfit as you go in, etc. They found that once they started this process of listening to their employees, eventually 92% of their employees started giving suggestions.
When you're implementing an opportunity for employees to participate, give their opinions in particular, but for others as well, what kinds of processes and maybe mindset need to be in place in order for that to come alive and come to fruition with good ideas?
Now, that's a really excellent question, because that's one of the things I also emphasize in my class. It's not enough to just put a box out there and say, put your suggestions in. First of all, you got to open those suggestions and read them, and you have an iterative process whereby once an idea is brought up, then someone's got to take ownership of it, typically the person who suggested the idea. Of course, you filter out the really crazy stuff, the impossible ones you just tend not to bother with. But the things that are reasonable, you should give the person who suggested it some time, maybe 3 months, and some resources. For example, if it's a purely technical person who came up with the idea, give them a marketing person, right? And tell them, look, you've got 3 months, go off and figure this out. Come back with sort of an early prototype and sort of an early business plan which identifies who is going to buy this stuff, right? And then you come back after 3 months to this executive group, which meets on a regular basis, maybe every week or something, and you probably have 5 minutes to explain to them why your idea is good and what you have found and so forth. And then it becomes a question of, one of three things may happen. Either the executive group may say, sorry, it doesn't make sense, go away. Or, okay, you've done part of the work, here's another 3 months worth of resources, come back, right? Or it may say, okay, this is good, now let's give you maybe a year's worth of resources. Go back and do a full proof of concept and come back with that, right? And so again, there is a second stage where after the 1 year or something, or 6 months or whatever it is, you come back and you're evaluated. Now you must have a pretty decent business plan. You must have some customers. You must have some success stories, etc. And again, the executive group may say, nope, not good enough, go back, redo it, or sorry, kill it, or okay, next stage. So the next stage is when you say, okay, now we're going to put some resources, and you, the guys who came up with the idea, are the ones who will now become, in effect, the general managers of this mini enterprise. Go off and do it. And again, they do it, they do the engineering and the production and so forth. Then there'll be a final gate where once again the executive group, before the thing goes to market, evaluates it. And it's possible that at even that last stage, even after the money has been spent, the executive group may say, sorry, this is not ready for market. So a process.
Rajeev, imagine you have in front of you a CEO and maybe hierarchical, maybe averse to risk, maybe likes to take control of things. Tell me why I should be more creative and accepting of mistakes.
One of the things I often ask my students is, do you know how many companies that were originally in the Dow Jones Industrial Average from 1892 or something are still around? And the answer is 1. Okay, all but General Electric have died of the first Dow Jones Industrials companies, which were at the time the most important companies in the world, or in America. The same thing is true in India. So there is churn. And there is a very interesting analysis by a professor named Chris Christensen from Harvard. He has come up with this idea of incumbents versus insurgents, and how incumbents almost automatically will fail because insurgents don't have anything to protect. So if you're a boss in a company who's trying to protect something, it's very likely that some guerrilla out there is undermining you at this very moment. Now, that guerrilla can be inside your company or it can be outside. So if you do not encourage the guerrillas inside your company, they'll either leave or other guerrillas outside your company will undermine you. And this has happened over and over and over again in every sector. It's not just a high-tech thing. It happens in the steel industry. It's a very interesting example of how these mini steel mills basically came in and wiped out the big steel mills like United States Steel and so forth. There is someone who is out there already plotting your downfall, and it's great if it's your own people. And examples I would give a person like this. One is IBM. IBM was always one of the most powerful companies in the world, and then they encouraged this sort of guerrilla activity called the PC Group, which is away from their headquarters, which is in New York. This is over in Florida or something. It was like a tiny little group that was not even very visible, and they ended up being a big success. Similarly, Hewlett-Packard, they had a group of engineers over in Boise that were doing their printers. Again, these little guerrilla groups that were kind of hiding, stealth activity they were doing inside the company, ended up being big successes. So I think it's obviously not the case that you must encourage every crazy idea that comes up from engineers, and engineers are capable of incredibly crazy ideas. But I think the process that I mentioned to you of giving them a little rope and see if they hang themselves or if there is any point to it. The companies that are doing that are increasingly finding themselves to be more attractive companies